Good afternoon, everyone. This is Diana Arias with the Community Technical Assistance Center, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Getting to the Heart of Motivational Interviewing. In order to implement motivational interviewing in practice, clinicians and providers must understand what MI is and what it is not. Through conversation between our knowledge experts today, participating audience members will have the opportunity to hear about real-world applications of MI. This webinar will address MI principles and skills, along with how to avoid common traps when utilizing MI. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to orient everyone to the WebEx system so you know how to participate in today's event. Please note that upon joining the webinar, you have been placed on mute to avoid any background noises that may distract others from listening to the presentation today. If you come across any technical issues during today's event, please chat to the host who will be able to assist you. You will have the opportunity to submit questions for the Q&A portion of today's presentation by utilizing the chat box feature, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. If it is not visible, click the dialog bubble in the top right toolbar and it should appear. In order to ensure that we're able to answer as many questions as time permits, we are requesting that you send in your questions at any point during the webinar, and we will address them during the Q&A portion of today's presentation. We are very excited to have with us today Christine Toner, both a trainer with the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers and a clinician with vast experience across populations and settings, as well as Naomi Weinstein, Vice President at Innovations at Institute for Community Living. Once again, thank you for joining us. I will now pass it along to Christine and Naomi to get us started.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm Naomi.
I'm Christine.
Just so you can recognize the different voices. And today, Naomi. I'm going to be interviewing Christine about motivational interviewing. So I guess to start off, Christine, can you just help us get started by defining what is actually motivational interviewing?
Yeah, that'd be great. So one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind is that the first edition of motivational interviewing came out in 1991, and that was really based on work with an addictions population. And through the years, it has been revised to go to larger populations. So we see it used in the healthcare field, in the community corrections field, the mental health field, child welfare. So there's been vast application of motivational interviewing. And I think when you look at this definition, you start to see sort of why that has come about. One, it sort of starts with this idea of it being a person-centered approach. And so when motivational interviewing first began, the idea was, can we look at just counselor behaviors and see the impact that that has on behavior change? So prior to that time, we had spent a lot of time looking at sort of the outcomes for the client. And here we were really switching to look at how is it that the counselor is interacting with the individual that brings about behavior change? What are those components? So it's a person-centered, and then you see here directive method of communication. And that really comes from that understanding that, as I said, the beginning research was around an addictions field. The idea that most of the people that we were seeing were coming in perhaps mandated either through family or through courts and so forth, and that we were agency-based in our work. So that it couldn't be 100% person-centered in the sense that you could go wherever somebody wanted to go, but it had to have this directive sort of method in there. Mm-hmm. And then this idea of intrinsic motivation and ambivalence. And those key terms we keep coming back to throughout in a deeper understanding of MI. One is that we have to own that there's interactional motivation as well as intrinsic motivation. And our interactions with the individual can spark the intrinsic motivation that the individual has. And how we understand the connection of ambivalence to motivation. And that is something that MI really pushes us to understand better.
Can you talk about the ambivalence piece a little bit more?
Yeah, so I think this is a key piece that oftentimes it gets discussed in training, but it doesn't have the deep dive that I think it needs. The idea is that oftentimes we see people as ready to change or not ready to change. That it's sort of this yes or no kind of question. And I've heard sort of clinicians struggle with this and say, well, if they're not ready, what can I do? And the idea is that can we instead see people as ambivalent, and that is really saying that somebody feels two ways about something. It is not that they do not recognize perhaps some of the benefits of change. At the same time, though, they also see some of the benefits to remaining exactly the same. So it's sort of this seesaw kind of thing, right? On the one hand, I could try, but why? I want to, but I'm not sure how. Should I or shouldn't I? So that when we start to see people as ambivalent, instead of are they ready or are they not, it sort of gets us into that grayer area of change. And so that's why we have here sort of how do we help people move from that severe ambivalence, and what kinds of things do we need to be doing to help people hear their own ambivalence.
And then just to clarify, in terms of the seesawing, is it seesawing or is it that they're having both feelings simultaneously? I guess when I think of seesaw, I think of now I'm here and now I'm there, but there's a...
That's a good point. So yeah, so I think that absolutely. So it can be that they can be having both feelings at the same time, and then obviously sometimes you might hear a little bit more of what we call change talk, and other times maybe a little bit more of what we call sustained talk. But absolutely, you're right, a seesaw is probably not. Sometimes we also talk about it as a water balloon, in the sense that if we squish one side of the water balloon really hard, what happens? The water rushes to the other side. So what happens with ambivalence is oftentimes we come down really hard on the side of change, giving lots of good reasons why somebody should do something. And so you're squishing that one side of the water balloon, the side of change talk. And so what happens? All the water rushes to the other side. They defend the sustain, the reasons why they cannot make this change. So the idea is, how do we stay in the middle with them? And our interviewing wants to be in that middle place with them until they're ready to move.
Right. But I mean, what you're making me think of is when I've talked to friends about boyfriends or girlfriends, and they say, well, what do you think? And you say, well, that's a really great guy for you. Like, well, actually, he's not so great for me.
Exactly.
Or like, oh, he's perfect. And they go all the way to the other side.
Yes.
So that they're having that balance.
Yes, that's exactly the dynamic that oftentimes happens. Yes.
Okay. So when we're talking about ambivalence, what do we do to move people out of it?
Well,
one of the
things I think is important is we have to keep in mind that the ways in which we speak, and we know this intrinsically, right? So it sort of seems like, of course, the way we speak to people matters. The fact is, though, that we don't spend enough time really looking at what we are saying and how we're saying it, how much we're talking versus listening. And what we've seen is that confrontation, when we confront less and listen more, resistance can go down. So it has a lot going back to that idea of the more we stay in the ambivalence with people, the better off we are in terms of them hearing both sides. The other piece beyond this is that, as many of us know, nonverbals are super important, right? So sort of how we come into every conversation. Oftentimes some people have used the adage, it's less what we say, but sort of how we say it or how we present it. And so in motivational interviewing, we like to spend a lot of time thinking about how we enter every conversation, the ways in which we sort of embody what they call the spirit of MI.
And what's that?
And so the spirit of MI, it is one of these things, and as it was mentioned earlier, I do a lot of training on motivational interviewing, and when you look at this list, I'm sure you can start to see the challenge of being able to train around any one of these bullet points. This is really predates before you even get to the skills that we're talking about, because you can teach skills, and if you do not approach it from a place of compassion and that you want to work in collaboration and that you are trying for empathy, they will all fall flat. So one of the things that is very important on this list is this idea of accepting. And so oftentimes people feel like, well, I can't accept because of, and you can fill in the blank, because of some sort of behavior or something that might be happening. And what we're really talking about here is sort of the other person's sense of warm regard, of sort of being accepted by the person that they're being interviewed by. all of these things, when we ask folks who are interviewing, oftentimes we'll say, well, yes, I'm respectful, I'm empathic. Again, the question isn't a self-assessment piece, but it's if I ask the person you just interviewed, did they feel that these things were embodied in that conversation? People who go on and sort of get further training in MI oftentimes submit tapes, so it's somebody else listening to your conversation, and do they feel this spirit coming through your dialogue? And then the other one on here that I just want to sort of highlight is honoring of autonomy and choice. And I want to highlight that because oftentimes people will say, well, they have to do this. They have to do whatever it is because of perhaps a court mandate or perhaps some other reasons that are sort of there. And so people don't even touch this piece of how do you support and let people know that it's their choices, right, and that they always have choices, and that as long as they are okay with the consequences of their choices, they have the right to sort of exercise that choice. And the reason why this is super important is because if you think about any choices or any changes you have ever made, it is oftentimes because you have convinced yourself and you have decided this is the change you want to make. Very rarely is it that somebody says, I'm doing this because my counselor said so, and that's enough to keep them going. Most people feel very disheartened or sort of not autonomous if they're feeling like they're doing something because somebody's pressing upon them and forcing them to do something.
Right. One of the things that makes me think about is trauma-informed approaches and how important it is to help people understand that they have control and choice. So it just speaks directly into this. I mean, I know another thing that we were talking about is when we do remind people that they have a choice, we often remind them in a somewhat blaming, nasty way. So from my days in drug treatment, there was often a conversation that would go on where the client would say, well, I don't want to be here. The judge just made me be here. And then the counselor would say something to the effect of, no, it was your choice. You made the choice. You had a choice between jail or here, and you chose this, so, suck it up.
Right, right.
As if that's a way of really honoring someone's autonomy and choice.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that really speaks to the issue of the spirit here, right? The idea that I could almost hear that counselor also being like, well, that's what they said in MI to do, right? And that goes back to sort of the ways in which we use ourself, our tone of voice, the discussion point. The idea that honoring autonomy and choice also comes with a relationship that you have with the individual where you can be saying to them, it's your choice, to be here or to not be here. If you choose not to stay at the facility, there will be consequences. You might be returned to jail or you might be returned to prison. As long as you're okay with those consequences, it is 100% your choice in your life to decide what to do next, right? And that's a very different tone, and I wouldn't lead with that either, right? That comes after knowing somebody for a period of time who you're still sort of struggling with and still having difficulty, reminding them that there is a choice in here. And the other piece that you mentioned, which I think is so key too, is when you think about sort of trauma-informed and other approaches that your organizations may be using, I think it's so important to remember that motivational interviewing is clearly an evidence-based practice. And we have to remember that it's a communication style, so that different than maybe other models and practices you might be using, MI very fluidly fits in with other practices. So it's not a either-or kind of thing. And so I think sometimes organizations and workers struggle with sort of like, well, we have so many of these models that we're using, and remembering that motivational interviewing is a communication style that can be used in a variety of settings, including your own personal life, your home life, and so forth, in terms of how you think about this.
But but to be clear, it's a communication style with a goal.
Yes.
It is not communication. I mean, yes, all those great techniques are all wonderful, but you're trying to move somebody along a journey towards a behavior change.
Absolutely. It's very important that you have in mind what the behavior change is that you're speaking to, because when we go on later and look at some of the skills, it's important that you're constantly tying it to that behavior change that you're looking for.
Got it. So how does the motivational approach differ from the traditional approach?
Well, one of the things that we know is that our traditional approach originally sort of came out of or was based a lot on sort of what we think of as a medical model, right? So that from the counselor's perspective, we placed a great deal of importance sort of on the behavior change. And so what happens when we just look for the outcome, that's the behavior change, we miss the sort of small steps along the way. Also, oftentimes we feel that we have to control sort of the behavior change, and that might mean everything from problem solving for the individual, being very directive on the best ways to achieve a certain goal, and sort of providing sort of that roadmap to the individual. When we talk about motivational interviewing, we talk about first determining the importance of that behavior change to this individual. And so for many of the folks that I train, oftentimes the folks are not working on just one behavior change. There could be several. And we're looking at asking them, how important is it for you to even work on this? You know, what area do you feel that you really want to look at? The importance of listening. And so there's many different types of listening, and here we're really talking about how we can truly be mindful and in the moment to listen to understand, and to really start to get a sense of what their concerns and their needs are in the current situation. Also, we talk about in motivational interviewing always starting with the individual. So what are their thoughts on how to achieve this goal? What do they think that they can do? So that we always sort of elicit from the person first, what have you tried in the past? What are you thinking you could do now? Before we provide whatever we might have to offer. And in our offer, there should always be the ability to say no. So we should always be offering information by saying, I have some information, would you like to hear it? Or I know some things that have worked with other folks who've been in your situation. Would you be interested to hear more? Again, that's a way to continuously support control and autonomy on the individual, because it provides them the opportunity to be like, no, I'm not really ready to hear what other people have done about this, or whatever they might have to say.
I think I just want to underscore that point about determining the importance of the behavior change for the person. You know, I think about, you know, any of us, at their work, if you have a client who perhaps is the goal is to reduce their dependence on substances, but they may also be battling a possible eviction. And how much of their energy are they really going to exert on trying to cut down on their drug use when they are facing a very real-life crisis? Mm-hmm. And so they may say, yeah, it's really important, but right now I've got to take care of this. Or my daughter's sick, my daughter has cancer, and I'm in and out of the hospital all the time. I can only do so much at one time.
Right.
These behavior changes are so gigantic, and so understanding the importance of the person, the competency the person feels, and where that priority level falls.
Absolutely. It's key. And the fact of the matter is that sometimes when we don't understand that, and we don't understand that the person doesn't feel like they have any self-efficacy to achieve that goal at this moment, because they have these overwhelming other crises like eviction or other things that are going on, that makes it very hard for them to focus on sort of addiction or some of the other issues that they might have. Which makes it so important that when we're thinking about motivational interviewing is that we're sort of keeping in mind sort of this undercurrent of some of the principles, of some of the ways in which we kind of talk to people about whatever the behavior change might be.
So what are the core principles of MI?
So to begin with is this idea of empathy, and we saw empathy on an earlier slide. And you can't sort of underscore this piece enough. And the piece that I want to sort of speak about here is this expressing of empathy. So it is my sense that oftentimes folks who are the interviewer can feel empathic, which, I like to think about it as the visual, as really literally coming alongside the person you're interviewing and look out the way they look out. So oftentimes we're sitting across from people, but if I sat right next to them and I looked, like, what are they seeing, and can I see things as they see them? And so that's a piece of it. But the other piece of it is, did I say it, right? Did I express it? Did I reflect it back to them? And it's not about saying, I understand, right? Because oftentimes we might not. And it's not that individuals are oftentimes just looking for someone to have the same experience as them. They're really looking for, do you understand my perspective? Do you really see things as I can sort of see them? So that's really a key piece to sort of get to sort of begin our thinking, is how much can we express that empathy to the client. The second piece here is really about oftentimes when we had the slide earlier about confrontation and things of that nature and why it does not work. We like to say that in MI we're sort of hard on the problem but soft on the individual. So that's like another reason why we want to sort of backpedal away from that confrontation, because we're really talking about the problematic behavior and not really about the person necessarily. And so here we want to build inside that person the discrepancy. And so what we mean by that is saying to them, I've heard you talk a lot how important this housing is to you and how you really are very happy having your own space. And at the same time, this is the 5th time you've been caught smoking in your room. How is that going to, how's that going to work, right? So you're basically asking them to develop that discrepancy, for them to sit with the fact that they value the housing, they want the housing, and they're breaking a rule by continuing to smoke in the unit. So oftentimes what we do is we step in and we explain, you know the rules, you can't smoke here, it's the 5th time we've caught you, right? So we step in and fill in the gaps. And if you think about any change any of us have ever made, it's because of that discrepancy, that feeling of between the lives that they want and what's currently sort of happening. So we want to be able to develop that discrepancy more and have it sit with the individual. The next one about resistance. So resistance in general, I think, is an overused word, and we've lost track of the fact that resistance originally was supposed to indicate to us that something was going wrong between us and the person we were interviewing. And we've kind of gone shorthand and gone to, there's something wrong with the individual I'm interviewing. They're resistant. They're not ready to change. They're not doing what they're supposed to be doing.
But I'm doing everything right.
But I'm doing everything right. I'm trying really hard. And so I think we have to remember, first of all, if we can start to move away from that mindset and to understand that it is natural to have a response to change. And unfortunately, the response to change tends to be negative. So I oftentimes like to think about, I like to have my groups think about at their organization, or have they ever worked for an organization that has undergone any kind of change, a new policy, a new practice, a new procedure, something coming in, and what has been the reaction, right?
Even a new colleague.
Even a new colleague, yeah, anything. And generally speaking, organizations tend to deal with a lot of that pushback, right? The I don't want to change, I don't want to do things different, what was wrong with the way, and you hear all that MI stuff, the defense of it was great the way it was, right? I just met with a colleague who's like, we're going back to the old school ways, like super happy, right? So the idea that oftentimes people sit and hope that a issue will fall apart at an organization and the old school ways will come back, right? And so if that's hard for us, and that's only that's one slice of our lives, our work lives, and you think about the changes we're asking the majority of folks we're working with to make, are changes that sort of touch upon every aspect of their life. So they're pretty large changes oftentimes. So it would only be natural that there would be reluctance and some pushback to making that change. And so I think, again, it's so much about what is our mindset going in and what's the space that we're in before we even begin the interview. And then the last one is, how do we support self-efficacy? And self-efficacy, I think we sometimes forget.
Can you just define self-efficacy for a second?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm familiar with it.
So self-efficacy is different than sort of self-esteem and other things. It's really the belief in self that you can do something, right? And so if you think about anything you've ever done, even if you were unsure or convinced, so if you trained, let's say, for a marathon and you started running smaller road races and so forth, you didn't know for sure, but at least you had the belief in self that you would be able to complete a marathon. So you kept going and training and working towards that, or completing college or completing high school. When you don't think that you will ever complete it, you're not going to start it. So the example I give oftentimes is a young person who may not be doing very well in high school, and you ask them, is it important to you to have a high school diploma? And they say yes. And so then they don't follow through. We tend to think of that as a lie instead of, yes, objectively, it is important to have a high school diploma. The bigger question is, do they think they will be able to get one? Will they achieve that? And then the answer oftentimes is no, because I haven't been to school in a year, I haven't done this. So how do we embrace sort of the client's autonomy? And where we sometimes misstep here is, again, going with that youth. We oftentimes come in with, well, here's a new high school program, why don't you try this? Here's a Metro card. I talked to the counselor. You can start on Tuesday. You know, so we problem solve and put together a package instead of embracing their autonomy and their own natural problem solving skills. And if they don't have them, sort of helping them develop those problem solving skills to come up with a plan to help that client transition to that change.
So part of that is us just moving too fast.
Yes, there's a big part of us moving too fast.
Okay. So having a sense of those underlying principles, so what are the skills?
So we like to talk about sort of these micro skills, and I think it's important to, again, reiterate that motivational interviewing, the deeper you dive into it, I think the more complex you start to realize it is. So when you look at these skills, for many people, I'm sure you're thinking it looks like active listening techniques. It doesn't look that different than sort of person-centered kinds of counseling techniques like Carl Rogers and so forth, and you're absolutely right. MI in no way says that they somehow came up with the idea of open-ended questions. It is how we use these micro skills to move people through ambivalence to change by listening for what we call change talk and sustain talk, and how we stay focused on that. So when people feel like, well, I've gone to my MI training and I have my OR skills, you have some foundational pieces, but where MI truly becomes MI is these concepts of ambivalence and change talk and sustain talk.
Can you define change talk and sustain talk quickly?
So change talk and sustain talk are both sides of your ambivalence. So change talk is any talk that can only come from your client that indicates that they are willing or thinking or desiring to make a change or open to making a change. Sustain talk are the things that sort of keeps them where they are, the reasons why they can't maybe, or the reasons why they like where they're at, right? And it's the other side. So it's really, when you talk about ambivalence, you're talking about one side of the ambivalence is your change talk, and the other side of your ambivalence is your sustain talk.
Okay.
So open-ended questions, I think we all are pretty, familiar with, that you tend to get more information. The one thing I also like to remind us about is that folks who use a lot of closed-ended questions tend to work in bureaucratic settings, tend to come from sort of a more law enforcement settings and so forth, and we tend to want to be in a more relational space with our clients. So open-ended questions help us stay there. We also want to think about how we use questions. So why questions, for example, although they are open-ended, we tend to want to stay away from, because oftentimes things like, why didn't you make the meeting, why weren't you here at 2, can sort of start to feel confrontational or make people defensive. Affirmations is definitely one of the most neglected strategies.
Can I go back one second? Yeah. One of the things that I've read about with open-ended questions is about open-ended questions with younger people. and how things can sometimes be too broad and need some structure. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, so open-ended questions is an interesting one, right? So I think we have to remember our definition way at the beginning, right? So that it was client-centered, directive, right? So we also have to be, it's not just being mindful when we get to our reflections, but being mindful throughout. So let's not ask questions that are not particularly good, right? So, you know, tell me what you've been up to since the last time we met. It's an open-ended question, absolutely. Are you going to get a good response? Probably not. You're probably going to get a nothing, or I don't know, or because it's just too broad, right? And if you're really interested in whether or not they kept an appointment or whether they went somewhere that you had kept, you know, said they'd go to, you might instead start with, tell me a little bit about how things went at housing court tell me a little bit about how things went at housing court. Right? So it lets them know. The other thing is with teenagers and youth, I like to think about a multiple choice open-ended question, right? So that might be something like, because we oftentimes find they're not very talkative. So you might say to them, tell me a little bit about what's been going on. Did you make it to school every day this week? Were you able to talk to your guidance counselor, or something else? Right, so that you always leave it with something else, and you're sort of asking them A, B, and then there's always an very open to let them go where they want to go. That supports their autonomy and choice. But it also narrows the field a little bit to let them know that there are certain areas that you're interested in finding out about.
Okay, thanks.
Affirmations are the most neglected strategy, and they're really so important because they're about how do I let this individual know about the strengths and abilities that I see in them and that they possess, and that those are the things that they're going to need to use to sort of make this change, right? And so affirmation should happen in every single contact. Sometimes we don't notice the strengths and abilities of our clients until we're back at the office, or maybe we're talking to our supervisor about a particular case. And so it's so important that we're ready to sort of affirm. And affirmations are different than praise. Praise is something that comes from you. You know, I'm so proud that you graduated high school, which is fine, except it's not an affirmation. An affirmation is you should be really proud of yourself. You were able to complete high school, right? So it's just stating what is or what's happening in front of you, and that they should have that sense of pride. And that's ultimately that intrinsic motivation, that they should be doing things for self versus doing things because it'll make their case manager happy.
But I think there's an interesting distinction between the cheerleading function, right, that people often confuse with motivational interviewing, and the hollow praise.
Right. Yeah, and there is no cheerleading function in MI, really. I mean, the thing is that it's stating what you're seeing, right? And so cheerleading I oftentimes think of as, go, you know, you're good, you're doing great, keep going, right? And the thing is that is very hollow. What you need to do is you need to tie it to what's actually going on for that individual, right? So, you know, if you want to tell somebody you need to keep going, right, the idea is to say to them, you know, you can really do this just like you did when you completed junior high, right? So it's like tying it to their actual life. It's the difference between your supervisor just saying good job and saying to you, you do a really good job with complicated families, right? The second lets you know that actually they're paying some attention to the work you do, and the first just kind of just thrown out there like a good job kind of thing. So the affirmation should always be very specific and sort of highlighting a strength or an ability that you see that they have.
And so that's about building competency and self-efficacy.
Yes, it's totally tied to that principle, absolutely.
Okay.
And then reflections is totally tied to empathy. How do you let somebody know that you're sort of empathic, right, is through reflecting what you hear them saying. Reflections are not repeating because that's a parrot and that's annoying. And I like to say that if people feel like reflections don't get them anywhere, it's generally that your reflections are not deep enough. And so your reflections have to be about what is said, what you see is happening, and it's your sort of your hypothesis as to what you think is going on underneath what the person is saying.
From my perspective, when I've seen people in motivational interviewing trainings, reflections is where they get stuck. Yes. They often see, everyone's like, oh, I can do that, that's easy. And then they try to do it and they completely miss the mark.
Yes, because what happens in our general conversations are something like we ask an open-ended question, we get an answer, we ask another open-ended question, we get an answer, we ask another question, we get an answer. And so in an MI, and that's the other thing about MI, they talk about a rhythm. They're saying that for every open-ended question you ask, there should be 2 reflections before you even go on to your next question.
Okay.
So that you should be in a much more reflective place to hear people much more. And then we'll talk about in a minute sort of that all reflections are not necessarily equal. There's choosing, right? Because again, our definition of MI was that it was a directive method of communication, and the directive piece is also about how we are strategically choosing what we reflect back to people. It is not to reflect just so I can check off the box and say I reflected. It's how do I strategically choose what this person most needs to hear back. And then summarizing is a longer kind of reflection, usually focusing on any kind of change talk that you may have gotten throughout the conversation. And can happen in a variety of ways. It can happen to start off your meeting, right? Because you can say, you know, last time we met, you sort of summarize and give them a sense of what you talked about last time. Sometimes you'll use them to transition from one topic to another in the middle of your conversation or at the end. The important thing with our summarizing is, one, the focus on change talk. So any change talk that we heard throughout the interview would be repeated here again. And we always want to introduce that we're making a summary and end with, would there be anything else you'd like to add? Did you feel like I missed anything? You know, something that sort of invites them again to that idea of partnership, the allowance that I might have missed something here.
All right. Can we go on? I'm going to move over to talking about that identifying change talk issue, which is what you were just talking about in terms of reflections and choosing what to reflect.
Sure. Okay. So here's a good statement, right? Identifying change talk, and I talk about how it flickers. And the reality is that, you know, if we were getting people coming in being like, I'm ready to change and this is what I want to do, you'd probably only have to meet with people once, right?
And you wouldn't have a job.
And you wouldn't have a job. So the idea is that it's not easy to hear change talk. So let's take a look at this statement here. I don't know why I am the one that is here talking to you. It's his fault too. I want to fix it, but how can I when he is not here? So I like to envision this statement, or at least I envision this statement of a residential setting. And so you can see, I think, the hooks in here. So if this was said to you, we can see that there are some hooks in there. One could be that you might go after the information about, well, it's not about him, it's about you, let's focus on you, right? The idea that you go over again the information, sort of that resistance, right? That would be going after your response options. The first one would be the resistance, right? So going after that, that would be the first part of that statement that I might go after to reflect that back to them. So you might say something like, you're concerned about what's happening to your roommate, or, you know, you don't understand why you have to be here, right? So that might be a resistance piece, right? I might focus on the ambivalence in there, right? On the one hand, you seem to realize that something that you were a part of what went wrong today, and at the same time, you're worried about the other person not, you know, facing the same repercussions that you're facing, right? That would be a response, a reflection around ambivalence. Now, where is the change talk in there? So the change talk is, I want to fix it. Right? And so the recommendation might be to focus on that. And then my reflection might be, you want to make things right with your roommate. So motivation to change can increase when you hear yourself. So that's what's key here, right? So that each one of those reflections, I like to say that there's no wrong reflection, right? But if we're going to be strategic about our reflections, we have to pick up change talk each and every time we hear it. We cannot let it fall off the table.
So can we try a demonstration for everybody so they can hear what this looks like?
Okay.
All right. So let's do so.
So thank you for coming in today. I know that Dr. Jones had talked to you about coming in, and I appreciate your time coming in. Can you tell me about what Dr. Jones told you about our meeting?
Yeah, he says my cough is really bad because I smoke too much, but I don't know what you can do because it's me, the person who's smoking, not you.
Okay, so it sounds like what was brought up to you was his concerns about your smoking. Can you tell me whether this has ever been a concern for you?
No, not really. I mean, when I was younger, I smoked a lot. My mom didn't like it until it smelled up the house too much, but it doesn't really bother me at all.
So you've been smoking for a very long time and see no reason to stop.
No, I like smoking. It's like what I do. You know, I smoke first thing in the morning, and when I drink coffee, and I smoke when I'm talking with my friends, and when I'm with my boyfriend, and it's what I do when I'm stressed out. It's just something I do to stay calm.
Wow, it sounds like it's a really big part of your life.
Yeah, definitely.
So tell me a little bit about why you even kept this appointment today.
The doctor told me I should come. I don't know.
So you pretty much listen to what the doctor tells you to do?
Yeah, I don't like getting into trouble for stupid stuff.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about some of your other expectations about our meeting today.
I don't know. You said you were some kind of therapist or something, so I figured you could do something to make me just, like, not want to smoke.
So you're interested in not smoking?
I mean, if it would help my cough go away and make it, like, easier to go up and down stairs, it's not a horrible thing. But, you know, I've tried quitting a couple of times, and it just never worked. Something always happened, and, man, my life gets out of control, and I get really stressed out. And, you know, like I said, smoking calms me down.
So I'm sort of hearing here a lot of reasons why smoking has been very helpful for you. It's been a stress reduction. There's specific times of the day that you can think about that you've really enjoyed smoking. It's been a part of your life for as long as you can remember. I'm also starting to hear the emergence of another lift, that you've had some difficulties with coughing pretty consistently and some difficulty with the stairs.
Yeah, my son doesn't like it either.
Okay, so that's another thing that has caused you some difficulties at home.
Okay. All right, so that's just a really quick flavor of this, right? So what did you hear? Can we just like tease out? Like,
yeah, so I think the one piece that I would want to sort of, that I zoned in on that I thought was really quite sort of my hook in, right, was when you talked about the doctor, when you said something, so I figured if you could do something to make me not want to smoke, right? So that doesn't sound like some great earth-shattering change talk. It sounded more like if I was to have sort of my other hat on, I'd be thinking that like you're hoping for some pixie dust or something to make it go away, very passive.
Yeah.
But I heard it as change talk, and I kept pushing it through. The other thing I could have done with that statement, when you said I figured you could do something to make me not want to smoke, I just went with a reflection, right, on the change talk, you're interested in not smoking. I could have also said, well, we do have some things. There's a patch, because there is actual things that we can give you in medication, right? So I could have gone for straight problem solving there, too, and started to go into a discussion of the array of options you have at this point. Again, this is too early on to provide you with all of that, and I just want to stay with that theme and see what else I can pull out for any reasons on the other side.
Right. I mean, what I was hearing a lot of reflections.
Yes.
When you were coming back at me. The big one that I heard was when you kind of summarized, it was a combination of a summary and a reflection.
Right. So this is a very good example of sort of the idea of addressing ambivalence. And you'll notice that the word and is used, which is instead of but, right? So we want to always join our two kind of comments together with and. And you'll see that I land it, right, on the list of reasons why to change, right? And that's really, again, part of the strategy of MI, right? The idea that I started with, I'm hearing two lists. On the one hand, smoking is stress reduction, and you enjoy smoking at specific times during your day. It's an integral part of your life. And I'm also hearing you notice. So what do we think that person's most going to hear when I was done? the latter part, right? Because our attention spans universally are fairly short. So I'm going to land on the part that's strategy on my part, on the part that moves you towards change. I'm providing you both, and I'm not joining it with but, because if I joined it with but, it minimizes whatever comes after.
So and is a critical word.
And is critical. That's why I sort of highlighted it there. If we just think about our own lives, nothing good comes after but, right? The idea that, you know, you go in for an evaluation or your supervisor meets with you, you've done really well on X, Y, and Z project, there's just one thing I'd like to talk to you about, and then that's it, right? It all goes downhill.
Yeah, all right. So I'm just noticing that we are coming towards an end, but I don't want to let this go without talking about some of the traps that we fall into. I know we've talked a little bit about the cheerleading, the kind of misinterpretation of am I being cheerleading. Something else that I always notice is that people think it's pretty easy to do, but it's unbelievably complex to actually practice. But there's some other kind of official MI traps.
Yeah, so these three I think are always important to keep in mind. One, the writing reflex. So the writing reflex goes something like, I am going to help you, and by helping you, I'm going to make things right? I'm going to problem solve, I'm going to give you lots of options, and it comes from a really good place, but it silences the other, right? The more we try to write things and people ask us, and so we feel like we have to tell them. The big hammer is really about intensifying, right, that the downside of someone's behavior. We tend to oftentimes feel like when people are not changing quickly, that they don't appreciate enough the downside of their behavior. So I like to think about like somebody who might be coming in around diabetes management. The big hammer would be reminding them, you know, you can lose your toes. Some people have even lost their leg, right? So that's the big hammer, right? I can say it in even a very calm way, but it's sort of that reminder of, you know, this is the downside if this behavior continues.
So by smoking will lead to lung cancer.
Exactly. And then the idea of this confrontation and denial trap, right? The idea that we oftentimes think that sometimes people just need to be sort of confronted with their behavior, that they need to sort of face it so that they can sort of move on. And the reality is that people, when confronted, tend to naturally deny, and they will go down with that narrative, that it tends not to bring about sort of what we sometimes have seen on TV, sort of these cathartic moments of, you're right, I did it, whatever, right? That's not what happens, right?
And that's not just clients. That's all of us.
Yeah, that's all of us.
Any of us accused, did you take it? No.
Right.
Like,
exactly.
Doesn't matter what we did.
Right.
Yeah.
So, so it's really about how we sort of move away, and again, it goes back to that developing discrepancy and talking to them about, you know, I'm confused. You know, on the one hand, you've talked a lot about how important this is to you, and yet here we are again with this issue, right? So it's more about sort of going in from this sort of, I'm curious, right? Remembering that we want to be hard on the problem, but soft on the person. And confrontation and denial is being really hard on a person and their personhood. And you're really just trying to pull out the problematic behavior. You're not really trying to give the personhood, you know, damage the person that's sitting there.
Right. So given all that, kind of big picture, last thoughts.
Okay, so it's very, so I like to think of it as MI as a way of being with a person that requires restraint, curiosity, and the avoidance of fixing it. So that's a really like just big takeaway for me in all my years, right? The idea is that for me, it takes a lot of restraint, even to counting to 10 in my head sometimes, to really just give people space to really talk and really be in that space with them.
I know that we've talked about patience.
Yes, yes.
And one of the things that I've learned from you, Christine, is kind of the power of the pause. Like, we can just be silent, wait, hold off. So
yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think sometimes when you start using this, when the silence comes, it feels like I did something wrong or they didn't understand what I said. And I think we minimize the power of people hearing themselves. And I think we don't give ourselves enough credit of how important it is to just sit with people and to really hear them. And that sometimes change does not come quickly, and we are sort of nervous that because we work for an agency pregnancy or whatever, if we don't move that person fast enough, something isn't right.
Can you define what can take a while means? Sorry.
I mean, the thing is that I think we all know this in different ways, that we plant seeds and sometimes we don't see the full change. I think the reality is that human beings under stress oftentimes revert back to older behaviors, that to make these kinds of changes can take a very long time. I mean, there's a whole bunch of work that looks at, sort of saying, if it's 6 months of changed behavior, you can sort of say that the behavior's changed. Some people would say that's too little. It really depends on the individual and so many other things. I think that the reality is, for those of us who might be familiar with sort of thinking about stages of change, I mean, I think we're always at action and our clients are not even near that. And so the way we speak to them is as important as what we say, and sort of reminding them that you are patient and that you can sort of hear them as they go through the process.
Okay. So I guess we'd like to take some questions and answers at this point. Or we'll take the questions, we'll give you the answers. Sorry. Any, I can see.
Yes, thank you so much,
Great.
Christine and Naomi. Yeah, we're going to turn it over and begin answering the questions that have been submitted during today's presentation. As a reminder, audience members, you can still submit some questions through the open chat box. So let's see, Christine and Naomi, our first question is, playing devil's advocate, acknowledging that the goal of MI is to get the client to, quote unquote, want the change because it is something he or she has decided upon, what do you do if you know that their decision or their choice won't exactly work and won't lead to the desired goal? So in other words, how do you prepare the client for possible failure?
Okay, it's a really good question. So I think what's interesting is that, one, I don't know that we always know that what they're thinking or what their path is going to lead to failure, right? So that's number one, right? I think that there's nothing wrong with saying to somebody, right? So it depends on the, obviously it's a broad stroke kind of question, but I think that you can say to somebody, it sounds like you've really thought this out and this is what you've decided to do, right? So you sort of reflect back to them what their plan is, and they'll say, yes, that's my plan. And then you might say, I also have some other ideas. Would you like to hear them? And they will probably say yes, and then you can provide them some of the other ideas that you have. You can also say to people, no one's saying in MI that you never sort of offer any information or advice. You can also say, it seems like you've given a lot of thought to your plan. You have a plan put together, and I have some thoughts about your plan. Would you like to hear them, right? And so then you could offer some of your concerns as well as hopefully balancing that with some of the high points of their particular plan. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much.
Sure.
Cover the buzz.
So our next question or comment more so is, let's see, playing devil's advocate. Oh, I'm sorry, I just read that one. Considering the impacts of toxic stress, trauma, and ACEs, folks' response to possible change may be called negative. On the other hand, it may be more about continued survival, and this may be more of a trauma-responsive way of thinking about it. So I guess overall, can you speak to how responses by individuals with either a current or past trauma history and MI may play out?
We're looking at each other. We're trying to figure out the best way to respond.
Thank you.
Well, I think honestly, that's probably at play with, my guess is the vast majority
of 95% of people.
Yeah, I mean, without, going too broad strokes on this, my guess is that those things that you mentioned, sort of your ACEs, your toxic stress, trauma, all of those pieces are at play in the vast majority of clients that folks are seeing on this call. Having said that, I think that what really helps for all of those things and is in keeping with the MI approach is the idea of helping them hear themselves. And so that even if some of that thinking the clinician's sense is distorted due to toxic stress and trauma and things like that, it is most important that the client first hears that this is what their thoughts are or what's happening for them, and then sort of move with them to see if you can get them to start to see things from another perspective.
I think it also probably takes, I'm not a BMI expert, but I would guess that there's also a piece about senses of self-efficacy and the clinician slash therapist slash counselor slash MI practitioner focusing a lot on competency and strengths and trying to help a person identify what they have already accomplished and pushing that piece through.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, other questions?
Great. Thank you so much. Yes. So we have a question from, again, one of our audience members. I work telephonically with members. Would you recommend doing anything differently if you were interacting via phone as opposed to face-to-face interactions?
So, I mean, the one thing that makes it hard with, you know, telephone kind of work is obviously you can't use other cues in your reflections. You really have to stay very focused on just what is being said. And so, because we like to talk about reflections not just being based upon what somebody's saying, but sort of their facial reactions or other things that are happening. So clearly that's not available. Besides that, I would say that there's really nothing that's really different. You just have to be even more aware because you can only go on tone of voice, right? And so oftentimes, you know, like even doing this webinar today, right, so you can only hear my voice, and so some people would get a better sense of me if they could see me as well and read my nonverbals and all those kinds of things. So you have to be really acutely aware of your tone of voice and keeping it steady so that reflections don't sound like questions and things like that. So when doing telephone work, which, you know, that would be the one thing I would talk about.
I would also imagine it would be important to figure out ways to minimize completely every possible distraction because MI requires so much mindfulness and presence that, I mean, I know that if I'm on the phone and I've got something else on my computer screen or there's, you know, the dog is running by, whatever it happens to be, it's hard for me to be fully there. So I'd imagine that would be a challenge also.
All right, thank you so much. And another question we have, can you give examples of nonverbal cues?
So I'm guessing they mean from like a client?
I'm sorry, well, yeah, examples for when you're interacting with a client.
Yeah, so I think that, you know, sometimes when clients are talking or telling their story, right, they might look down, they might shift in their seat, they might lean forward, they might get up and pace even, you know, so there's a whole bunch of different things that their body language starts to tell you. And I think that's just as important to be using so that you might say, you know, I noticed that when I asked you about smoking, you started to fidget with your ring, right? So that you sort of let them know that, like, you're seeing that these things are happening while you're talking about specific things, or so that reflections, or seeing somebody who comes in and you suspect that perhaps they're not taking their medication, and you also, they appear sort of different, right? So you might say, you know, you appeared down today, or you look down today, tell me what's going on, instead of leading with, have you been taking your medication?
Great, thank you. So I do want to thank both you, Christine, and Naomi. For any additional information, you can certainly contact Christine Toner at the email address on your screen right now, tonerchristine@yahoo.com. Once again, once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you could complete that and provide your feedback. So I do want to thank everyone for joining today's webinar, and if you have any additional questions, please feel free to contact us at ctac.info@nyu.edu. I also want to call attention to upcoming events listed here on your screen. And lastly, on behalf of CTAC and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and we hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you.